Welcome. My name is Alix Gould-Werth, and I am the Director of Family Economic Security Policy here at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I am delighted to be with you all today for what promises to be a rousing conversation about social infrastructure. We'll talk about what it is, how it undergirds the growth of our economy, and the once-in-a-generation opportunity to strengthen it that we're looking at right now. Now, you might be wondering what I mean when I use the term social infrastructure. I'm referring to social policies and programs that are foundational to our economy. So that includes our care infrastructure, programs that help families meet their caregiving needs like childcare, paid family and medical leave, and home and community-based services and supports. It also includes income support programs. Those are programs that help provide resources to help households ensure that they have the income that they need. Those resources sometimes come through direct cash transfer in programs like Social Security and unemployment insurance. Other times they come from programs that provide essential goods like food or housing, and then thus free up existing household income to be used for other purposes. Okay, so together, our care infrastructure and our income support system form the basis of our social infrastructure. And when our social infrastructure functions properly, it spurs economic growth that is strong, stable, and broadly shared in three major ways. First, it increases the number of people who are able to participate in the labor force. Second, it supports the healthy development of young children, which strengthens the human capital of the next generation of workers. And third, and very importantly, it stabilizes the macroeconomy. So I'm guessing that I might not have to remind this audience that we are on the precipice of a once-in-a-generation investment in social infrastructure, but bear with me, let me name a few of the high points just for fun, right? So Congress is discussing establishing a comprehensive paid family and medical leave program, revolutionary investments in childcare and early education, and making the new monthly fully refundable child tax credit a permanent program. It is also in the midst of a nail-biter of a conversation about reforms to the unemployment insurance program. So while discussions of these social infrastructure programs often focus on their contribution to well-being at the individual level, it's also important to examine these programs with an economic lens. And we are so lucky to have a panel here today that is comprised of experts who are pioneers in connecting the dots between social infrastructure and economic growth, as well as making social infrastructure programs run on the ground. I've also had a peek at the RSVP list, so I know that we also have experts in the audience, along with people who have a keen interest in this conversation and personal experiences with our nation's social infrastructure. So please make use of the chat function to share your reactions and thoughts with the group as we're talking, and don't hesitate to submit your questions for the Q&A in our Q&A box with your name and affiliation, and your affiliation if you have one. If you run into problems with the Q&A box, just put those questions in the chat. And there's no need to wait, just post them as you're thinking of them so that we can respond quickly and timely way to your questions. Okay, so that's the housekeeping. With that, let's get the conversation started. I'm going to turn to the panelists and I'm going to ask each of you a question, hoping for a 2-minute answer, and I will be mean about asking you to keep time. Okay, so let me first turn to Hilary Hoynes, who is a member of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth Steering Committee. Hilary is a professor of economics and public policy and holds the Haas Distinguished Chair in Economic Disparities at the University of California, Berkeley. There, she also co-directs the Berkeley Opportunity Lab. Okay, so Hilary, you have this big body of research that looks at how income support programs affect human capital development and labor force participation. Can you tell us what you find?
Yes, thank you so much for including me in this incredibly important conversation at this incredibly important time. So just delighted to be here. I'd like to make kind of 2 points from the quite large and strong set of research studies. And the first one is that, as Alix just sort of teed up, we've got a growing amount of evidence that says that when we provide more resources, particularly for children, and particularly when they're young, and those resources take the form of income support programs, like Alix mentioned, food support, some evidence on cash assistance, the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit. We find that when resources increase in the family, it not only alleviates poverty today, of course, but what we've learned in the last 10 to 15 years is that translates to a change in the life trajectory of children on average. So we see children who have more resources when they're young, having a higher level of completed education and have higher earnings, less likely to be poor themselves as adults. And we also have evidence that shows that these children, when they become adults, are also healthier. And so this adds up to really what is a very strong return on an investment of these core elements of the social infrastructure. So that's really the first point. The second point is, as I like to say, when I was a baby economist 30 years ago, economists spent most of their time quantifying the effect of income support programs on work today, focusing on the parents and the recipients, without much attention to quantifying these benefits. And really doesn't make much sense to think about the cost of a program without also thinking about the benefits. What we've learned from that work is that certain ways of providing income support can create, perhaps at most, a modest reduction in work. But what the next generation of work is showing us is that we may have had that thinking all completely wrong. That is, when income goes up, and of course the other elements of the social infrastructure that we're talking about today, that spending actually facilitates and supports work as opposed to discouraging it. So putting that all together, I think makes a very strong argument from the research that we can think about these programs and the social infrastructure more generally, really as an investment in those children that also provides returns to society as a whole. So I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Hilary. And so useful to think kind of deeply about what social infrastructure really means for labor force participation, one of the key engines of economic growth. One of the other things that I think is so interesting about social infrastructure's relationship to the broader economy is its contributions to the macroeconomy and macroeconomic stabilization. So to talk about that, I'm going to turn next to William Spriggs. Bill is a professor in and former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University, and he also serves as chief economist to the AFL-CIO. So Bill, we both sat on the National Academy of Social Insurance's Economic Security Study Panel, which covered a wide range of social infrastructure programs, and you are one of our nation's leading experts on unemployment insurance. Can you talk to us a little bit about how unemployment insurance and other income supports affect the macroeconomy?
We learned a very big lesson this time about what unemployment insurance is capable of doing. So thank you very much for having this important session and for asking me to speak on this. By adding additional money to provide a higher replacement rate for unemployment than is typical, we learned some key things. First, we knew going into this that people with low liquidity, those who had low savings, the proverbial family that couldn't meet a $500 unexpected expenditure. Well, those families, when you give them an unemployment check, rather than spend it, as many of us think they might, instead, they instantly start to save and build up precautionary savings. They're very aware and acutely aware that they don't have liquidity, and their instinct is to use that check to help build that liquidity in a moment of economic panic. By giving additional money, we found that in fact, we could get low-income families to spend the money. And very importantly, because of the peculiar nature of the distribution of personal services in low-income neighborhoods versus high-income neighborhoods, and this downturn, by keeping the consumption of low-income families up, in fact, returning to their pre-pandemic level, we lost fewer low-wage service sector jobs in low-wage neighborhoods than low-wage service sector jobs in high-wage neighborhoods. And that's because, of course, there's a difference in services. People in high-income neighborhoods go to spas, but this kept a lot of jobs in place and in neighborhoods where jobs were scarce. This is very important. The other thing is every downturn, the difference between the replacement rate from an unemployment check and from Social Security disability is huge. By helping workers with additional money to their unemployment check this downturn, surprisingly, even though we lost 20 million payroll slots in February, the biggest drop in US economic history, applications for disability insurance collapsed during this period. It didn't spike like we've seen in all other downturns. During the Great Recession, applications for disability insurance spiked greatly. That did not happen. The good news is workers who are on unemployment stay involved, searching for jobs, attached to the labor market. So actually, surprisingly, the unemployment insurance not only, as Hilary pointed out, not only did it not discourage work, it encouraged continued attachment to the labor force, did not tax the Social Security system. These are key and important things we ignore because we get so hung up. I think Hilary had it very right. We get so hung up in a normal economy. What does unemployment do? But in a crisis, unemployment is the automatic stabilizer that saves us. Congress stepped in because it would have been inadequate in this downturn. We need to learn some lessons from this downturn because of the success that we had this time.
Thanks so much, Bill. And I think you are really pushing us to learn lessons from the crisis that we have just experienced and many of us are still experiencing. And so I think that tees up Shilpa really nicely, because I'm interested in thinking about how do we move forward in this moment. So so Shilpa Phadke is here with us straight from the White House. She is the Special Assistant to the President for Gender Policy and Deputy Director of the Gender Policy Council. So Shilpa, you've spent time outside of government thinking about the connections between programs like paid leave and childcare and economic growth. And you've also spent time inside government working on actually building the social infrastructure we've discussed so far. So building off of kind of the lessons that Bill was talking about, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for strengthening social infrastructure in the US context?
Thanks so much for having me. It's so great to be with you all. And agree with Hilary, this is such a unique moment in time to be having this really important conversation. So I would just take us back for a second, right? I focus on gender policy and women's work. And the history of women's work is that it's often unpaid, unvalued, and really invisible. Yet it's the work that allows for all the other work to happen, and that's the care work. And so if we think about families and communities, centering women's economic security is really central to that. Take it to the macro level, our economy, our global economy can't really reach full potential if we're leaving, more than half the workforce behind. And, women's work is not a nice to have. Like, it's a must-have for families. And so I'm really excited to be at this moment where we're taking on these barriers to workforce participation, and that we're really thinking about what is the unique experience of women, especially women of color, in work. These were problems before the pandemic, I think we would all agree, but they're really front and center now. And so, what does it mean coming out of the pandemic when sectors where women dominated were hit really hard? What does it mean when we don't have schools open? We talk about social infrastructure as care, but also the education piece of it. And what does it mean when 30 years of women's progress in labor force has really gone backwards? And so I think we're at this really incredible moment to take on the structures, this deep-seated inequity, and really think about what does it mean to value the care work? And what could that mean for our economy? I think there was a Moody's analysis that said the president's Build Back Better plan could increase GDP, 10 to 15 points, increase labor participation by a couple points. And so putting care front and center in this conversation just seems incredibly important.
Thanks so much, Shilpa. And, it is exciting to think about kind of the opportunities for investing in care infrastructure on the federal level, and also really exciting that we have some really good maps to follow of what happened at the state and local level, which is one of the reasons that I am so excited to have the Honorable Jessie Ulibarri here. Jessie is the State Innovation Exchange's co-executive director. A former Colorado state senator, Jessie has dedicated his career to building progressive power from the states outward. So Jessie, you led the initial charge for paid leave and paid sick days in Colorado, and Colorado is now the most recent state to pass a paid leave law. How do you see social infrastructure affecting individual people and local economies?
Thanks for this question, Alex, and for the wonderful data and information from the other panelists. I want to bring my own lived experience to this conversation, both as a former senator and as someone who represented an incredibly low-income district. I represented the area where my grandparents raised my parents, including the trailer park where I spent my earliest years of life. And of the 5 school districts that I represented, more than 90% of the students there were receiving free or reduced lunch. So when we talk about social infrastructure, the basic necessities of how we engage in the world around us and whether or not we have an opportunity or ability to thrive, it is things like childcare supports, it's things like income supports, it's the basics of navigating life in a community like mine. And so you've heard compelling economic and macroeconomic data, and yet there's a real human case to be made here that as we think about expanding forms of paid leave or paid sick days, or really the broader view of social infrastructure, we are talking about real people's lives. And I want to make 2 very important points. At the State Innovation Exchange, it's the national network of legislators who are working to move bold, transformative policy in the states. There are many pathways to these kinds of changes that we see possible now, and some that are actually the new blueprint for additional federal reforms or support in the reconciliation package. But I want to be clear that social infrastructure can be and should be broadly impactful, and we must think about the equity impacts at the local level. And second, it's broadly popular. 6 conducts public polling, nonpartisan public polling, and across the board, there's broad public support, regardless of partisan affiliation, for the EITC and the child tax credit, for childcare, for affordable healthcare, paid sick and medical leave. And often what we need to do is continue to push as quickly and boldly as we can at the local, state, and federal level for interrelated strategies so government can work the way it is intended, and that is for the people.
Got it. Thank you. So it's so kind of stimulating to hear kind of a conversation about social infrastructure from many angles, right? So we're hearing from Jessie, these programs are broadly popular and they really affect people's lives. We're hearing kind of about the major contributions that these programs make to the strength of our economy and to facilitating economic growth. And so I'm listening to what you guys are all saying, and I'm like, this is obvious. This is good. This is something that it makes a lot of sense to be investing in as a nation. Yet our investment in social infrastructure has been lower than some peer nations. So this is kind of like a little puzzle. And I'm wondering about why the United States has been slow to embrace this concept and invest in it. So Hilary, would you take the question first? Like, what do you think is going on here?
Well, let me take the question from the standpoint of the kind of income support program part of the broader social infrastructure. And I think if you look back on American policy, thinking about the war on poverty programs and subsequent to them, we've typically taken an approach where we target benefits on the most needy. And then that seems sensible in many ways, if you start to think about where the resources are most lacking. But that overlaid with the long history of structural racism in this country has led to stories about welfare queens starting in the 1980s that has continued since that time. And what that's sort of generated is a context in which people, average American voters, don't necessarily see themselves as benefiting from these elements of the social safety net, and see those as sort of other folks. And that seems to have led to the risk of policies that are not meeting need, not equitable, and and also just not serving the population. And so what it appears to be that we're at a moment at here is that we're kind of thinking about changing that book, that sort of playbook, and following approaches that many of our peer countries do, where they tend to embrace more universalist policies. So if we look back at what is clearly an extremely successful response to the economic crisis out of the pandemic, we had elements like the economic impact payments, the supplements to unemployment insurance, and then subsequently the 1-year child tax credit at full refundability. And each of those 3 critical programs, as the results from the census study on poverty last week illustrated, could both reduce disparities as well as provide benefits more universally to lower and middle income Americans. They're broadly popular. They reduce disparities. And I think the idea would be that they would be less prone to subsequent reforms in the future because of their broad base of support. Example number 1 would be Social Security as coming out of the New Deal. So I think if we think about the child tax credit and take a family with a child over age 6 with $3,000 per year in terms of child tax credit benefits, that is a benefit that they can depend on. Whether their earnings go up a bit because they move from a part-time to a full-time job or go down, they have the safety net of that monthly benefit that isn't going to change if their circumstances change. And what we know is that that's what insurance is. It's providing that insurance that you can plan around and plan for using. So that's sort of how I see the past and how I would pivot towards thinking about how we're going about that differently in our policies now.
That's so helpful, Hilary. Right, we're bringing in kind of the political economy story into this and thinking about how program design affects support, thinking about how kind of racist tropes can undermine the programs that we all need, and that how kind of universal program design could be a really promising path forward. So Shilpa, I'd like to turn to you. We've heard from Hilary about income support programs, thinking about care infrastructure in general. Is the story similar? Is it different? What perspective do you have from your time kind of working within government?
Sure, I would say a couple things, and Hilary's framework is really helpful. I think oftentimes we live in a narrative that just doesn't match with reality. A narrative where there's one breadwinner and 2 kids, and family structure is, heteronormative, and here we are in a world where one income is just simply not enough to raise a family, where costs of education and care, healthcare, childcare are just increasing and taking up more of families' budgets. And so the reality is that you need 2 people to work to be able to make ends meet in most cases. And so if that's the case, and both parents are working, who is doing the care? And so I think it just really, we're coming to this paradigm shift, and the pandemic really exposed that, of what it means to have, everyone working to be able to keep up with the really, increased cost of living, right? In many communities, the cost of childcare is as much as their mortgage. And so it really calls to question just, tough family budgeting at the kitchen table. And so I think if we start from that perspective, of what do families need to feel supportive, and what does a living wage really look like, and how do we support our older Americans and our kids at the same time. The vice president today is doing an event on the sandwich generation. Then we have to reset the policy solutions, and the interventions just have to be different. And that's where I think we are. And I think that's what the Build Back Better framework does, is really try to get at the realities that families are facing now with increased costs and not a lot of support.
Thanks for that, Shilpa. I want to react to that and pivot, but before I do that, I want to remind the audience that we are starting to come up on Q&A. So get your questions into the Q&A box, put them in the chat. We have these brilliant people here who I bet would be willing to share their thoughts with you. So I kind of, the phrase I heard Shilpa use, and that I kind of heard the thread of in Hilary's comments is this idea of paradigm shift, right? And that is how I set up the question. I was like, we haven't ever invested in social infrastructure. What is happening next? And we are in this moment of paradigm shift. But I guess I don't know if it's play devil's advocate, but think about reframing the question backwards and thinking about the strengths that we have in the past, right? So it's true that we've underinvested compared to peer nations, but at the same time, we do have this long history of investing in social infrastructure through programs like SNAP, which is the former food stamps program, programs like the Child Care Development Block Grant. Like we have to some extent been putting our money where our mouth is. And then states and localities in recent years have really taken bold action on programs like paid leave and pre-K. So I'm wondering, like, how at the same time as we're shifting paradigms, like how should we be building on successes that do exist? So Jessie, as someone who's built the foundation on these issues like paid leave, I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Alix. And maybe I'll start with some deep appreciation for the folks listening into this panel. I imagine many of them have worked on state and local campaigns to expand additional benefits, to look at new infrastructure that could be a model both for their states and for the rest of the country. And so maybe this is how we say paradigm shift. It's also the bending of the arc, right? All of us are pulling the arc down in the way that we need. But I want to lift up a lot of the successes we saw this year, especially in states. Paid sick and safe leave, for example, New Mexico became the 14th state to enact paid sick leave in 2021, and other states looked to expand opportunities if they already had the policy. Paid family medical leave, you had 11 more states considering this proposal this year, and 9 states in DC have already adopted paid family medical leave. Of course, we've heard about the historic investments in unemployment insurance, and yet states took bold action to complement or support or extend benefits as well, and conceived of ways to support different categories of workers that had not been traditionally included. States like Missouri and Washington established their own state-based EITC for the first time, joining 29 other states. And so you can see that there's a lot of work happening at the state level that is connected in this broader framework of change. But I want to be really clear. I think there's some clear lessons about how we build on those successes. First, we should be thinking about the ways that we can leverage interrelated supports. So many states said, how can we complement a federal investment with state-based supports that are targeted because we know our communities best? This interrelated strategy work of advocates, of government officials, of bureaucrats needs to happen where we're saying, how can we think differently about making the impacts that are needed? Second, many of these states that I just mentioned really thought about widening the eligibility framework for many of our social infrastructure policies. And this is to directly contend with what Hilary raised. We have to contend with the history of racism and racist tropes that have been used to undermine our public social infrastructure. And so thinking about including immigrant children, undocumented folks broadly, and removing benefit bans that have been in place, we actually have to do that work. And it is difficult work, but it requires organizing and changing hearts and minds. And then finally, there's technical aspects of program administration. I want to just lift up in Utah and in Tennessee, states that most people don't think about progressive economic reform. They actually looked at technical implications of their child care supports, co-payments, and things like child care subsidies based on attendance rather than daily enrollment, because that actually gets to the heart of how we think about the infrastructure over time. It's those innovations we have to look to and realize technical implementation really does matter when we're building on successes.
Thank you for that, Jessie. So we are about to get to Q&A. So I've been informed that the Q&A box is broken, which is very sad, but the chat box is working. So please put your questions into the chat box. And we're going to get one last word from Bill Spriggs before we move on to Q&A. So Bill, we're hearing about kind of the ways that this could be a paradigm shift, or the ways that we could be building on seeds that are already here in the United States. And I'd just love to get your take on this. Where are we and where we're going?
Thank you. I don't want to be the downer since I'm the last one, but I'm the downer. I'm sorry. A deep problem in the United States, and we saw this from the unemployment insurance system, is that we're states, but we still have failed to be united. Deeply rooted, as Hilary said, in a lot of American policy is America's wrestling with its history of racism. And we must be frank and honest that we have states that continue to pursue policies that more than echo the past when we look at what's happening with voting restrictions. But that was the case with the unemployment insurance program. vital to macroeconomic stability is if I'm a paper worker in New York or in Maine, I want workers in Ohio to continue to buy paper. If I'm a cannery worker in California, I want people to still be buying canned tomatoes. And in economic crisis, I don't want the state of Ohio telling its workers they cannot receive a federal benefit, but that's what happened. So I think we have to come to grips that as much as we would like to think that we win these wars, they continue. And we're going to have to think again. We need another paradigm shift that actually makes someone truly a citizen of the United States. I have always said when politicians say, I don't represent a red state or a blue state, I represent the United States. But if you're poor, you're a Kentuckian. If you're poor, you're a Mississippian. You're not an American. The benefits that you get depend upon the state in which you live. Your experience is vastly different. And as much as we celebrate those states that are very progressive, we have to deal with this deep inequality that doesn't afford every American equal protection under the law when you think from the perspective of what federal policy is trying to do. And especially as we faced a slowdown in August in retail sales, precisely because some governors decided their idea of macroeconomic policy was more important than Congress's mandate that we keep American consumers buying, that we kept American jobs going. And so we have to answer that challenge. The correlation between race and the attitude of states towards the social infrastructure is real. And we're going to have to find ways to overcome that. Otherwise, we will see very divided recoveries, and people not in states that implement bad policies will be hurt, because our economy is a national economy. It's not a state economy.
I appreciate that kind of pulling us back to some of the hard things as well as the optimism. And we are now entering the Q&A portion. So put your questions in the chat box, folks. But I, as moderator, am going to take moderator's privilege to kind of ask the first question and in direct response to what Bill is raising, right? So I think Jessie spoke about the importance of kind of shifting our narratives and our cultural norms and ideas in order to make the policy change that we want to see. But I think it's also important to recognize that one of the biggest messaging tools that we have available is the design of our social programs, right? This is a way that people in the United States internalize messages about who programs are for, how the economy works, their value as people. So if we want to use our social infrastructure as a tool to deal with, to kind of address racism in the United States, I'm interested in what you think are important elements of program design. So I think I'll take only one or two of you. So who's most excited to answer my question? It looks like Jessie.
I love this question. And I think there's some great lessons, especially in the recent implementation of the American Rescue Plan, that speak to some of the deficiencies in how we think more broadly about integrating strategies and program design. I've been very appreciative of and celebrating the achievements in the American Rescue Plan. And there needs to be a connective piece between local communities and both state and federal implementation of policy. We can't just cheer on when something passes without thinking about the technical aspects of implementation and really including directly impacted people in the work. I want to be clear, there are things like the child tax credit payments that are going for those who have bank accounts directly deposited, others who don't have bank accounts who are now getting checks and have to go to check cashing places. These are considerations we could have preempted and thought about different opportunities and challenges that folks would have as we were administering the program that could have happened really in contending with a history of race and racism, who has access to banking, a whole host of other challenges. And so thinking about upfront inclusion of folks who are directly impacted by these policies, having a sense of the real daily implications and implementation challenges is important. I would say the other part here is there needs to be a connected thread between actually thinking about program design and then actually getting in front of people who will be directly impacted by the policies themselves. At the State Innovation Exchange this year, we actually offered out a bunch of online ads and resources for folks to navigate the historic benefits of the American Rescue Plan, working with state legislators, because often the systems of our social infrastructure are disconnected in states. And so a person who applies for food assistance will also have to file separately for housing assistance, will also have to file separately for unemployment insurance. They're complicated, separate siloed systems, and having people to help navigate significantly change the outcome. And so when we talk about the actual application of getting people understanding the design principles, also we have to figure out the implementation principles. The passage of policy is not the end goal. It is the actual equitable implementation of that policy so it changes people's lives. That should be our end goal. And that means we have to think soup to nuts about how all of that goes, including ensuring that the folks who are eligible for benefits receive them. And there's great work that folks who work in government at all levels can do to make sure that is made possible.
I'm seeing nods from the panelists. We have 2 audience questions, but does anyone want to build on what Jessie is saying before I turn to those? Okay, so I'll turn to one that is on program design. So following up from Professor Hoynes' point about the benefits of more universal programs, how can we incorporate these benefits into our policy analyses? The standard seems to focus on impact, assuming 100% take up and ignoring the cost of stigma. So let me direct that first to you, Hilary.
Well, thanks for that question. It actually really dovetails very nicely on what Jessie was just talking about, which, it I was just like nodding vigorously as you were talking, Jessie. I mean, you're right. We don't have 100% take up of almost any program that we have. Though, interestingly, the more universal the program is, the higher the take up. That could partially be because of stigma. And I certainly think that that's part of the story. But the more studies that come out trying to understand why it is that we don't have take up, it seems that stigma might not be the most important element. And I feel like that's sort of a good news story from the perspective of our ability to change and increase take up. So it seems as though the evidence is much more consistent with Jessie's telling of the story, that folks need help navigating complex systems. And so our solution has to be to make the system less complex or to add more assistance to help folks access the benefits that they're eligible for. And so I think that, we have a basic pattern that the more universal the program is, we tend to have higher levels of take up. And so that could be one benefit. But we also need to think about steering people and assisting people to help onboard them. So thanks for that question.
Thanks for that answer. Okay, so we have one question that I hope we can address really quickly and then pop over to last thoughts. So this question is, I think that part of the problem is that care of giving has been historically devalued as women's work, which is evident in both how we ignore the care work being done at home and underpay workers who perform paid care. What thoughts do panelists have with regard to elevating the status of care work, both paid and unpaid? We only have time for one person to answer this, and Shilpa, I feel like the question was written for you, so would you like to take it?
Sure. And so I think it means, let me give one example, I guess. So Secretary Buttigieg recently had a new baby and has been seen taking parental leave. And so I think part of it is the shifting of culture and norms, so that we recognize that that care is universal and that everyone has the right and demand to receive and give care. And so I think when we talk about paid leave programs, it's designing them so that both women and men can take that time off. And that, in fact, will sort of shift culture, work on the stigma and be able to make it so that women aren't discriminating for taking leave when men take it as well. So I think examples like that, and culture is shifting, but our leaders have a huge role to play in sort of leading by example and pushing back against those sort of gendered caregiving norms.
Thank you for that, Shilpa. Okay, we are running right up against the clock. So what I want to end with is a 1 minute or less, maybe 30-second answer from each panelist on your message to policymakers in this current crucial moment. So thinking to lessons from the states on the importance of social infrastructure for economic growth and to the nuts and bolts of the current moment, what do you see as the most important social infrastructure details for Congress to get right? Hilary, 30 seconds.
Hate to call out one thing, but I'm going to have to call out the permanence of the child tax credit. It would reduce child poverty by 40%, the biggest thing we would ever do to reduce child poverty in one policy in American history. And so that's my plea.
All right, I love that, Hilary. Okay, Bill, your 30 seconds. What's the number one thing for policymakers to be looking at right now?
I have to go back and live their pledge to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The minimum wage is the shadow wage that we have for care. It is the shadow wage for women because we view them as nothing but care workers. It degrades the wages of women in all occupations. So they have to make us understand that essential workers are essential. They need to be paid essentially.
Great. Thank you for that. All right, Shilpa, your 30 seconds.
It's literally impossible for me to pick one. I reject the question. I would say, obviously, childcare, pre-K, lowering costs for seniors, first ever paid family leave program. I mean, all of it is essential, and I can't pick. But I would say one piece that undergirds all of them that I think we lose sight of are pieces in the president's proposal to raise the wages of care workers. And what it really means to boost the wages, make sure that a preschool teacher with similar credentials is paid the same as a kindergarten teacher, and thinking about those that do home care and assisted community-based living, what does it mean to have a livable wage? That would be truly transformative.
Thanks, Shilpa, for shouting out that less discussed and super important thing. And Jessie, the last 30 seconds, what do you have for us?
So I'm glad Shilpa took the everything answer because ditto everything. And I want to bring back something Bill said, which is we have to contend with how states implement. And I think we need to learn the lessons of the Affordable Care Act and how many states work to undermine that historic federal legislative success because of a legacy of racism in our country. There is a way for federal and state and local lawmakers to work in coordination to ensure equitable implementation of programs, but the planning has to start on the front end. And so policy makers at all levels have to be having that conversation now so we can think about the mechanisms of accountability when folks work to undermine the policy wins that we see just around the corner.